Milos Barutciski, je suis associé au cabinet Bennett Jones, où je suis le chef du département international. Je vais faire la présentation en anglais, mais juste pour vous dire, si vous avez des questions, et posez-les en français, je les répondrai en français, anglais ou un autre. So just welcome, thank you everybody. I'm a partner at the Bennett Jones law firm, a national law firm. We're the only Alberta-based national law firm, though our Toronto office is almost as big as the Calgary office now. We're across the country. All I was saying is that if you want to ask questions in French, by all means, feel free to do that, and I'll answer them in French or English or both, as the case may be. So just give me a second. I'm just going to get my notes up. I thought I'd have a bit more room up on this, but we'll manage one way or the other. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, that's not usually a problem. So my presentation today is about responding to potential problems as they first arise. So while the talk is part of the investigation stream, it could easily have been part of a compliance stream. And the reality is that the work of compliance professionals today often, not always, but often evolves into investigations work or investigations mode, and the line between the two is often blurred. And that's an important inflection point to think about before we launch into the topic, specifically because the drivers and the key considerations in day-to-day compliance work are not the same as they are for investigations. So while we like to think that in an ideal compliance world, everybody in the business would be fully integrated with the task. Everybody from the senior executive, from the CEO, right down to the board, down through the CEO, right down to the shipping floor clerk who signs off on the thing that's going to pick your risky country or risky customer. That's in an ideal world. That said, the world isn't an ideal world, and the degree of integration of operational people in compliance, in this case corruption compliance, varies immensely. So in short, what I'm getting at is compliance is a quasi-operational function where you do want the line business people fully engaged. It's also not something where head office drops compliance on you twice a year when they ask you to read the policy and attend a seminar and then sign off on the annual certification. That's not compliance. That's I don't know what to call it. It's charade. It's a joke, because when you show up with that as your compliance program at an RCMP voluntary disclosure, be it in corruption area or export controls or sanctions or competition law or customs fraud, I've done them all. I've done voluntary compliance, voluntary disclosure in every one of those fields, several in most of them, in fact several in all of them. And when that is your compliance program, you can forget about mitigating factors. One of the reasons, the key reason for having a compliance program, of course, is to comply. And that kind of from top down, just say no, don't do it, is pretty much useless to the poor fellow or the poor woman out in the field who's trying to manage a complicated situation where they're being shaken down. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But that's the key issue, the key distinction on this topic, which is responding to first signs of trouble. So that's why I say first responses starts with compliance. It evolves when things pop up. We'll talk about what things pop up and how they pop up. In fact, pop is the wrong verb. And then how you react to them. Context is all important, of course. When I say context, let's not forget, compliance is not, or compliance professionals don't have limitless resources. In fact, on the contrary. One of the first things to get squeezed when corporate management decides, oops, or your shareholders say, got to cut back a bit, one of the first things to get squeezed is compliance. In fact, a lot of back office stuff gets squeezed, but compliance is the soft one that is viewed as a cost center that doesn't contribute to the bottom line. Even though it actually does contribute to a sustainable bottom line, that is a longer term proposition. And once you're in that kind of situation where your shareholders, be they public or venture capital or whoever, a private company, when your shareholders are anxious about your costs, long-term sustainable business is not the immediate objective. Getting you through the next quarter is the immediate objective. So I don't know just to get a sense of, is this, who's a compliance officer here? Compliance officer. Anybody? Who's a compliance professional in some sense, legal counsel or otherwise? And who's a line business person, as in executive that actually delivers the goods and services? Okay, there's about half of you that didn't answer, or you're completely in the wrong room, in which case go ahead and get a coffee and we'll come back to it later. So actually all of this kind of, if you're a legal professional, that's often part of compliance. So when I say context is all important, what I'm talking about is the border between I'm dealing with a compliance issue, there's a question, there's uncertainty, and alternatively, I'm dealing with a crisis. So that's one thing. The other thing is, where are we? What are we talking about? And we'll come back to are we talking about a bookkeeping anomaly, or are we talking about your local agent in Timbuktu just got arrested for bribery? Rightly or wrongly, because as anybody who's paid attention to what goes on in large parts of the world, the first task of a new government after a coup or after an uncertain overthrow is to accuse the old guys of corruption. We've seen it over and over and over again. So the fact that they've been accused of corruption doesn't mean you got a corruption problem. It means that your local agent is in jail and suspected of corruption. You may or may not be collateral damage regardless of what happened. So wide range when we're talking context. If your issue is a bookkeeping problem, and your business is primarily servicing the healthcare sector, well, maybe this is a bad example, servicing, I don't know, private customers in North America, it probably isn't a big deal, and you're going to run it down. If your business is, as I said, getting concessions, oil and gas concessions in certain parts of the world, say Africa, or then maybe you pay a little closer attention. So context is all important. And managing the having said that, that doesn't mean the first sign of trouble. They're little things, and that's what we're going to look at. Doesn't mean the first sign of trouble is going to evolve into a full-blown crisis. In fact, most often than not, it doesn't. So your challenge is to essentially make sure that you don't overreact, while at the same time you don't underreact and ignore something that could evolve into a bigger problem. So for operational matters, and at this level, compliance is an operational matter, the key objective is balancing cost, efficiency, and quality. So what do I want to do if a red flag? We'll talk about red flags in a few minutes. If something comes to my attention that doesn't quite pass muster, what am I looking at? Well, I'm certainly not going to devote the kinds of resources that you would devote in a full-blown investigation. It would be crazy. You'd be fired pretty soon, for starters, and compliance within your organization would take a slightly different turn. You would be discrediting the compliance function because, as I said before, you want, in the ideal world, compliance to be integrated at every level in the business. So when somebody proposes a new market, a new customer, a new product, you want them thinking about the compliance challenges in that market. If that new market is, I don't know, China, Russia, somewhere in Africa, the Quebec healthcare sector. Sorry, that was a cheap shot. You want to be paying attention to compliance issues. If your market is public procurement, period, you want to be paying attention to the compliance sector. So the guys who are developing, who are deciding for the first time your company has no experience bidding for government contracts in Canada or elsewhere, and now they're going to get into the government procurement world, get with the program. You want them thinking, the business guys, thinking about compliance from that very stage. You're looking at acquiring an oil and gas services company. You're looking at acquiring whatever company. One of the things you're doing from the outset, it's the business people, not the compliance person 2 months down the line. The business people, the proponents of the deal, are the ones who should be thinking about compliance. So that's what I'm talking about, integrating. And then throughout. And in that mode at every stage, and that's including you as compliance professionals or legal counsel, you've heard what I have to say for the business executives among you, think about the compliance. Think about what the outside risks, geography, subject matter, sector, parties in this new business or new transaction or new proposal you're acquiring, you're putting forward, maybe it's an acquisition. So yeah, you think about it, and for the legal counsel and compliance professionals, again, you think about it, but you don't want to be impediments to the transaction proceeding successfully unless there is a good reason. That's not how business works. In other words, shareholders are not there to make sure the primary objective of business and the primary objective of shareholders, ultimately the owners of business, is to turn a profit, to generate revenue. It's not to be busybody do-gooders. And that's a tough balance for compliance professionals, as we'll talk about in a minute again. So on the other hand, when we're in investigations mode, and that's what I probably spend most of my time in investigations mode, the drivers change radically. When we're investigating, we're not talking about trying to move things forward. We're actually thinking about potential exposure, risk, reputational, ultimately liability to the company. That doesn't mean that cost and efficiency go out the window. They're important. In fact, they're extremely important, and I'll be talking to that issue a little bit more later this afternoon in a panel with Stéphane Doré of KPMG. There's a way to run investigations, and if you know what you're doing, you could run them efficiently and phase them and stage them. Or there's the American-inspired playbook that I've been dealing with for close to 20 years now, and I started doing my first large corruption investigation was in 1998, 99 actually. And we were doing them, there were only a handful of FCPA professionals, I think 5 or 6 firms in the US that had experience. Today, every large law firm in the United States, Canada, the UK, everywhere has deep experience in foreign corrupt practices and tons of depth and knowledge, and frankly, it's mostly nonsense. Okay, mostly what goes on is we take out the playbook, and speaking for the profession, I'm a little bit of an iconoclast here. What usually happens is that you have securities and other white-collar professionals who are very experienced in certain kinds of investigation. There's a playbook, and the playbook generally involves boiling the ocean down to the last pebble. Of course, you're paying the bills. Okay, so that's, but there's a reason why boards and executives are prone to accepting that, because once we're in that world, the situation is a little different. Once we're in that world, it's not just some anomaly that's at issue. We're talking about an issue that there's already reason to believe could evolve or expand into having a massive reputational and business and economic downside for the company well beyond the specific transaction. These investigations routinely dwarf the value of the business that triggered the issue. So it's not uncommon to see an investigation run to the tens of millions over a transaction or a piece of business that was worth perhaps even under $1 million. By multiples, I'm just thinking of, well, let's think about a couple of big international ones. Everybody remembers the Siemens case back in 2007, 8, whatever it was. The bill from fine standpoint was, fairly large, 1.6 billion when you add them up. Not too bad for a few days' work for the government. The legal and forensic accounting bills were closer to 3 million. To pick another example, Canadian case, the Nordion case. The Nordion case, I was Canadian counsel, we had US counsel, we made a voluntary disclosure. By the time the matter was finished, the legal bill was between $25 and $30 million. I can say that because the company was public and it disclosed in its SEC and OSC filings what legal expenses it had paid for in terms of the voluntary disclosure. The ultimate resolution was that we obtained a no-action letter from the RCMP, the U.S. Justice Department walked away, and there was a $325,000 fine from the SEC, not for bribery, but for a books and records violation. Okay, so you can see the disproportion, but the reason boards and companies, and I won't pick any one company, that is the reality. Boards and senior management are inclined to spend that kind of money, at least are prepared to spend that kind of money for a simple reason. It's their own personal liability that may very well be at stake, first, and then secondly, especially for public companies, there's the follow-on shareholder suits and third-party suits, and things start escalating in an international corruption. Now, I'm not talking only about international corruption, I'm talking about corruption generally, domestically as well. But in an international corruption context, by definition, you're dealing with multiple jurisdictions, so you don't know where it's coming from. At the very least, you have the agencies and the governments that are investigating you at home, possibly the host agency, and then you've got several in between, depending on where the money went, who your partners were, and so forth. But then you've got private parties who also have a stake and an interest. So yeah, And then the board and senior management are potentially exposed to both the government and the private agents. So, yep, they're going to spend money. The key is spending money intelligently. So the drivers in an investigation context, remember what I said about compliance? The drivers in a compliance context are cost, efficiency, timeliness, business issues. The kinds of things that drive the business people who are proposing the transaction and trying to get it executed. The drivers in an investigation are completely different. They're things like preserving the evidence. They're things like privilege. Certain privileged communications between counsel and company, between in-house counsel and company executives, if it's released, could be far more damaging than otherwise. What about securing cooperation from third parties? Witnesses, people who have relevant information. We start thinking about that. That means going outside the company, and that means going outside the company without blowing the whole thing up. What about securing cooperation from your own employees? Especially those who might feel they might have some exposure. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about when I'm on the investigative mode. And then finally, what about potential exposure of senior executives? Because that is going to aggravate, in fact, that's what's going to trigger the liability of the company. In Canada, in US law, forget it, doesn't matter. The shipping clerk did it, the company did it. In Canada, under Canadian criminal law, you have to show, for the company to be liable, you have to show that a senior executive, which is pretty broadly defined, but it generally means executive level people, so CEO, CFO. Some officers may not meet that threshold, and on the other hand, there's case law that says people lower down. A regional sales manager in a cartel case was viewed by the courts as being a senior officer for the purposes of the criminal code. Why? Because, well, he was only a senior manager. He was responsible for the territory that drove 75% of the firm's profits. Senior guy, by any stretch of the word. So it's not a term of art that you can sit there and parse and cut and filtrate and titrate purely legally. It's context driven. So when you have these people exposed personally, or where their exposure potentially implicates the company, again, those are things that, sorry, haven't been paying attention to the slides. I'm just going to find, there we go. Those are the kinds of things that, that drive the investigative world. So, for the compliance officer or the legal counsel in-house, where do I stand? Am I in operational mode where I'm looking at driving efficiency, at getting the business done, at keeping costs down, or I'm in investigations mode because what am I, as counsel, I have certain obligations. You know, one of the biggest balancing act for business lawyers is we're hired, we're not the business people. You, the client, are the business people. Our job is in part to help facilitate the transaction, but it's also to hedge, to cover, to think about what might go wrong and make sure that 2 years later you have that little clause, or if the deal closes and it wasn't what you expected, that you have the indemnity, there are reps and warranties and so on. Our job is to be professional paranoiacs in part, but we also want the deal to close. And where does legal counsel and compliance professional fits? It's the same dilemma. So it's the transition, it's that space, that blurred space in between that we're talking about. So let's start with something that I'm not going to spend too much time with, and I think there's probably going to be a dozen sessions that'll talk about this in greater detail. But like I said, responding to first signs of trouble starts with compliance. And so just to refresh memories, early in the conference, I think it's the first session, so let's talk about the key elements of a robust compliance program. And you're going to find these in any number of instruments. You're going to find these 6 elements, whether it's in the OECD's guidelines or whether it's in the World Bank's documents. You'll find it in the US Justice Department's guidelines. You'll find it in speeches by RCMP and assorted other officials in Canada. In fact, you're going to find exactly the same criteria in the Competition Bureau's compliance guidelines. You'll find them in CBSA and CRA's compliance guidelines. And if you look at the anti-money laundering compliance guidelines issued by FINTRAC, guess what you're going to find? You're going to find these factors, these criteria. So what are they? Okay, board and senior management commitment. This is the famous tone from the top. And what we want to see is that it's communicated unambiguously and in very clear terms to all employees. We don't do corruption. Okay, I mean, that's pretty good message. And of course, there's a bit more to it than that. But it's got to say that at least. Secondly, a risk-based compliance policy and procedures. In other words, it's all in writing, right down to the obligation to report best flags, corruption risk assessments for new businesses, for business partners, enhanced corruption risk assessment or due diligence for certain kinds of third parties. I see there's a, like agents and representatives in certain kinds of countries, and so forth. Yep, okay, we've got that. Dedicated compliance officer with adequate resources. Okay, what does that mean? For some companies, it means, well, if you've got 40 employees and you're, a $15 million or $10 million company, you don't even have a general counsel, your management structure is pretty flat, that person is clearly not going to be a dedicated compliance officer, and their resources are going to be what they can do during their business hours, and then maybe a little bit off site. Practically speaking, on the other hand, if you've got a large company, it could be a dedicated senior person with plenty of staff assisting them. Either way, that's what you need to figure out and right size for your company and your operations. And again, it's not a size of company issue. So what are you doing? If your business is government procurement, then you pay attention. There was an announcement this morning. I don't know if it's public yet. Well, it is public because I read about it in a trade periodical of a company called Free Balance, an Ottawa-based software company whose business, small company, whose business is to develop and customize and essentially deliver government accounting bookkeeping software around the world. Business is primarily, as I understand it, North American, but problems, as in good businesses, they like to expand their markets, and problems occurred in other parts of the world. So the company is now dealing with that issue. I think they've reached a settlement with the World Bank, and that was the nature of the announcement I saw. But a small company. So it's not a question of how big you are, it's a question of what are you doing, and what is the risk, the compliance risk of where you're going, because that's what's going to lead to the things bubbling up and the first signs of trouble. Targeted training for different levels of personnel, education, and so forth, from senior management on down to the shipping clerk, like I said. Disciplinary consequences for contraventions. The policy has to clearly say that if you contravene the code, the compliance policy, not the law, the compliance policy, there will be consequences. That doesn't mean you're fired the moment you contravene it, because like I say, some contraventions are just clerical error. It's still a compliance failure to comply because you forgot to fulfill your duty, and you need to be reminded. And in the disciplinary acts, which can be mild and can be a light tap on the wrist, but the company needs to enforce the rules against non-compliance, which means if you routinely and persistently ignore it, put your compliance program and compliance policy in the same category. As I said at the outset, you got the paper and that's it. Forget it, it's not worth anything. It's just a waste of money and effort and time. You will get no mitigating value for it. And then finally, regular monitoring and updating. Again, internal audit does your periodic spot checks. There's sampling of different ledgers, different accounts, different transactions. That's good, So you've got all of this. Yet you can still stumble in the compliance world. Why? Because a compliance program and a compliance policy is not a guarantee of anything. It's certainly not a guarantee of compliance. What it is, and the reason you have it, is to mitigate the risk. It doesn't immunize you from liability. It doesn't immunize you from bad people trying to shake you down and exploit your business. It gives you some tools, hopefully, and if you do the training right, and if you have the real commitment from senior management, gives you a way to respond to the shakedowns and the stumbles and the temptations that will arise when you're doing business of certain kinds, especially in markets and sectors and geographies, and with people who are, uncertain in their commitment to propriety. That doesn't mean you can't do that business. That doesn't mean you can't do business in countries where corruption is rife. Business is done lawfully, routinely, in places like China and India, to pick two countries. I've spent a fair amount of time in India. I've been to China half a dozen times, and I've acted for companies involved in business in China. It's not quite as overt in India. It's called the permit Raj. There's lots of other acronyms that people, now they have this app, I can't remember what it's called, but the app that you can have on your phone where you report a bribe. It's just like there are literally millions of these things on this app, but it's routine. It's just, there are so many, everything requires a permit. Every person who issues a permit expects a few rupees in exchange. That's the reality. But does it mean you can get on with it? Life is going to become a little bit more interesting now that the facilitation payments exception under our law has been repealed. But does it mean you can get on with it without doing that? Yeah, it does. You can actually do business in places in India without finding yourself routinely in non-compliance with our bribery legislation. So when I say compliance, the purpose of compliance is to mitigate risk and provide procedures to deal with problems. That's all it is. It really helps you to have tools. And we spend a lot of time on the paper. We spend a lot of time on the rules. What we don't spend a lot of time on nearly enough, and this is a large part of what this presentation is about, is trying to educate your own staff and your own compliance professionals on how to respond to these issues as they bubble, as they arise, as they surface. So as I say, it doesn't mean that you're going to be guaranteed of compliance, and in certain sectors and geographies, it's not a question of if we run into a problem, it's a question of when, because you do, like I mentioned, China, India. It's almost certain that you will run into issues from time to time. Doesn't mean you can't do business. So let's talk about, actually before we get to that, let's talk about the key part of this, or the core part of this presentation, which is what do you do when a potential, and how do you respond when a potential problem surfaces? And perhaps surface isn't quite the right word. Corruption, like a lot of other types of misconduct, rarely surfaces. It rarely comes up full-blown, obvious, clear to everybody. Oh, this is crooked. It tends to ooze up or bubble up in small odors, in small fragments, in small increments. And that's why this space between compliance and investigation, that's why response to first signs of trouble, that's why identifying first signs of trouble and maintaining some continuity between the signs of trouble. I use signs in the plural because it usually is plural. There's a smell, and then if you ignore the smell, whatever. And then there's separately and seemingly unrelated paper gap. And then there's a seemingly unrelated justification document missing, and so forth. So there are little things, each and any one of them might be explained, maybe are explained. But unless you start tying them together, you miss the underlying reality. So what are we talking about? Is it investigations? No, we're not there yet. Because if you throw yourself at investigations as a compliance officer, when you deal with these little increments, these little smells, the odors and the poor paper trails and so forth, you're going to be out of business because that's not really what your job is. But you have to start thinking early on, as I transition to these signs of trouble, about where this kind of thing can evolve and therefore target your actions. So one of the things we talk about all the time in compliance, but also in the later stage in investigations, is red flags. Who works with a compliance policy? Okay, a couple of people tentatively put up their hands, look about this high. Do they have a list of red flags, illustrative red flags in your policy? Does your policy have an illustrative list? Does your policy use the word red flags? Yes, okay. Generally speaking, most policies will talk about red flags because it's a kind of fundamental notion. It's about making sure that your staff are trained to, and that your policy says, when certain things, a red flag is a sign that there might be some indication. It could be a transaction that says, I will pay you $100 to do this on such and such a month. And then, of course, you think that thing is done. You get an invoice, but the invoice says pay a company that you've never heard of in a country that you've never heard of. Now, that's going to hopefully cause your internal controls folks and your accounts payable folks some heartburn because, you know, I'm going to cut a check to this company that I've never heard of. The business guy, your supplier who instructed you says, oh, no, it's not a problem. I owe them money, and I'd rather you pay them directly than blah, 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 blah. It's all kinds of cock and bull stories. But you know what? That's not illegal. It's just pretty risky and sloppy business practice. So that's a red flag. I'll tell you, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, companies didn't blink at that kind of thing. I mean, simply did not blink. Our rules about onboarding suppliers and payees have tightened considerably. I'm not saying it wasn't a best practice back in those days, though the word best practice is of rather more recent provenance. I think you know, the big four, and back then I guess it was 5 accounting firms would have told you, oh yeah, no, we want to, you know, we want to document when you onboard suppliers and so forth fully, et cetera, but practically speaking, it was routinely ignored. Today, a little bit, I'm not saying it's not ignored, but it's a little tighter, generally speaking. The problem is, but that's just a relatively simple red flag. The red flag could be, you know, trivial or more significant. Again, context is important. Context is critical where the red flag arises. Similarly, if you're a compliance professional or just a business person involved in doing transactions or trying to plan or execute transactions in complicated and risky environments, the pre-transaction approach is going to be, by pre-transaction approaches, you know, we're thinking about entering the Chadian oil and gas market, okay? A complicated market. There's at least one company who's been convicted of corruption in that country, and it has a lot of big players involved. Or we're going to think of entering the oil and gas market in Niger or the Democratic Republic of Congo. Well, the list goes on and on. You know, Benny Steinmetz and any number of investigations ongoing in that one. So in that context, your client hasn't sunk its teeth into the deal. You're looking for red flags, obviously, whatever those might be. And the cost of finding them and being disappointed are going to be manageable. People, if you find things that are going to be difficult, if not impossible, to overcome, your company may have to walk away from the deal, but it doesn't mean that they've lost millions. People will be upset. Post-transaction, a little bit different story. The project's underway. We've already sunk $500 million into the ground, digging the mine, because we're not going to see cash flow at least until year 4, because that's how long it's going to take to finish digging and get production and get the staff and build the power plant and build this and build the dam and build the... At that point, sunk costs are pretty substantial, let alone if it happens in a slightly different context. Think about 10, maybe a bit more, actually more than 10, 12, 13 years ago, I was acting for a company in the resource sector doing business in Latin America. And the project was now well into the hundreds of millions, like well past, like we're talking well down the road to completion. And all of a sudden, we find out about the so-called environmental investigation that was underway. What environmental investigation? We had the federal approvals, we had this, we had that. Oh no, the regional director of such and such, well, it's actually the regional governor in that particular instance, or state, whatever. Yeah, there was an investigation underway. What investigation? Well, the investigation that will finish when I see Mr. Green. Okay, so at that point, the dynamic changes a little bit. And if you as a compliance professional or in-house counsel or business executive suddenly see that deal threatened by something like this, you can be sure that you're going to get some scrutiny and probably a little bit of pushback. Okay? So, like I say, context and the shade of red flag and the stage of your issue is all critical. No one needs to be told when the RCMP is knocking at the door with a search warrant that, oh, this is serious, we better escalate it. You pick up the phone, you call your lawyers. A notch down from that, when the senior executive reports that your JV partner let it slip to her at a joint planning meeting that they paid hundreds or thousands or millions of dollars to somebody to secure the JV's concession in Milos. Yeah, no one questions that this needs to be bumped up a notch or two, escalated, and resources will be run to it. But what about a local media report in Milos that says your JV partner is joined at the hip with a senior public official in a country that is known to be a little bit, uncertain about its commitment to the rule of law and transparency? Does that get escalated? Well, for heaven's sakes, that's why we partner with these guys. They're connected. Well, that's a good thing that they're connected, they pay attention, but it could also be a bad thing. Is that sufficiently red, a sufficiently deep shade of red to get people to pay attention? Hopefully you knew about that connection as part of your due diligence, but maybe you didn't. Maybe they lied. Is that a problem? Let me think. Business partners and agents and representatives might lie in that due diligence questionnaire? Go figure. Does that ever happen? Yes, Virginia, yes, it happens routinely. Let's go dig a little further down. What about the employee who pulls you aside? You're a compliance officer. You're training the local staff. Pulls you aside and says, I've heard all these rumors about our team over on the Gulf of Mexico working with Pemex. Wild parties, they're just incredible time. They're off to the strip clubs, they're going to dinner. I kid you not. That is what happened in one of the investigations that I was doing involving a Canadian services company and Pemex. Night after night after night at the strip club. And with the officials, it got to the point where the executive was so fed up with it. I mean, he did not want to be doing it. So he finally said, Jose, just go. Call me when you're done. I'll come and pay the tab. Okay, so, but we only got to that bit after we'd finished the investigation and several $1 million later. So how seriously do you take those rumors? How do you respond to them? Notch it down a little bit more. An internal audit report spikes the flags a spike in payments to a local service supplier, spikes gaps in approval process, or missing justification trails on 2 or 3 occasions with the same employee or the same group. Uncertain or incomplete answers in when internal controls, the controls office says, oh, by the way, Frank, can you just send us the justification or complete the whatever? I'll get around to it. How do you respond to that? Is that a routine issue, an operational issue, or are we now starting to think about the drivers of investigation? And we can go on, tips, anonymous or attributed. Who's got a hotline, employee hotline in your company? Okay, a few of you. It's more and more typical. Who's got a whistleblower policy? One, okay. Maybe a couple more, just don't know about it. Those things, those are where those red flags come from. And how you deal with them. And by the way, don't forget third parties. Customers don't like being dragged into the mud sometimes. Same thing with suppliers and your consultants. Not all agents and representatives are crooked. Remember what an agent and representative, it means your lawyers, it means your engineers, it means your GR consultants, it means your environmental consultants, it means a lot of people. They're not all guys with great suits and 3 cell phones going on their sailboat in the Caribbean while they're making connections for you. Basically everybody, every service professional is an agent or representative in some sense. Agent if they're interacting with government from a legal sense on your behalf, and your representative if they're advising you and working with others. And then of course there's the apparent shakedown by a government official. The shakedown isn't always obvious. Sometimes the shakedown is repeated delays, and the expectation is that you will make the connection and volunteer. So how do you respond to that? First of all, how do you identify it? So those are the kinds of things that we're talking about here. Now that you're in this middle space that's neither compliance nor full-blown investigation, you have to think about a bunch of other factors. Well, some of the same factors I've talked about. Is it a proposed matter or is it an ongoing matter? Your reaction from senior management when you escalate it, because if you do start asking those questions and do start putting together the string of the odors and the increments and the fragments, expect some pushback because, again, like I said, we're in an ongoing matter. We're already well into the relationship. We've invested millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions. And now you're telling me because you, Milos, are suspicious that there might be something amiss, that we're going to go time out on the whole project and incur potentially all kinds of costs and liability. So that takes you into, you're not in full-blown investigation. Remember, something has come to your attention, a red flag. You haven't contacted outside counsel yet. Maybe you should contact at this stage in-house counsel for sure. But the questions you're asking, you're still a fact gathering. Who's involved? What information is available? What inquiries can I readily make without engaging expensive forensic accountants and lawyers and investigators? And what resources do I have to marshal to do this efficiently and effectively? Because remember, we're still in compliance mode, though we're running down the red flags, what causes me concern. And then finally, need to know. I suspect there's a problem. I don't want to sit there and put it on the side of the barn and put neon lights around it. Guys, sign of a problem. So I need to circumscribe who is going to help me and how they're going to help me in all of this. And then once I start getting into all that kind of stuff, and to the guy in the back, this is the last slide, so don't worry about it. Once I start taking these steps, now I'm inching much, much more closely to investigations. And now I'm getting into issues of confidentiality. Unless I'm in-house counsel, it's not a privilege issue, which is another thing to think about if you're a compliance professional. Most compliance professionals are not lawyers. A large proportion of them are, but mostly not, and the people you employ. So unless you've already escalated your matter to in-house counsel, general counsel, and then brought it under the umbrella of the general counsel, in which case, at least in Canada, in the United States and the UK, it's a privileged investigation at that point, if it's being led under the instruction of your internal lawyers. Anywhere else, it's not. Well, first of all, even in Canada, the United States, and the UK, it's not, unless you brought it under the direction of counsel. But in other countries, like France, like Germany, like most of Europe and large parts of the rest, in fact, most of the rest of the world, in-house counsel does not benefit from privilege. So these are things you got to think about. And then once you're a little further down the road, they get into the issue of talking to employees. Are you doing interviews? No, you're not doing interviews. You're just gathering facts. I'll do the interviews when the time comes. And there'll be a caution, and they'll be recorded, they'll be transcribed, et cetera. Not necessarily recorded, but might likely be recorded. There will certainly somebody taking detailed notes of what is said, at the very least. So, and then evidence preservation, and then now you're really at the cusp where you have run down your red flags, you have run down the odors, you've pulled out the anomalous journal entries, you've pulled out the justifying documents, the justifications for petty cash or expenditures that have 3 out of 4 questions unanswered. Now you're at the stage of escalating, and now you want to talk about who you're going to escalate it to and how you're going to do that. Not to make a matter more complicated than it really is, one of the issues that you're running through as you're going, before you do the escalation, while you're doing this fact-gathering analysis, for lack of a better word, is, that's why I said earlier, who's involved? Well, what happens if who's involved is the CEO? Being a compliance officer, compliance professional, is a thankless task. I can tell you the survey that Wall Street Journal did a couple of years ago, they are woefully underpaid relative to their peers in terms of the kinds of work that they do. And now, there's an article just recently in the UK, how the UK Serious Fraud Office and prosecutors are routinely, and in fact it's happening in the US, though I don't think anybody's written about it systematically, but what's happening is compliance officers are being targeted for failure to act on things that came to their attention and they didn't identify. So it's a tough story, and I'm sorry to kind of bring it, but that world, that line between compliance and investigation is probably the hardest one to navigate and probably the one that's fraught with the most difficulty for companies, let alone the professionals work them. Thank you.